No.
No.
As the director of the GIBS Ethics and Governance think tank, I have pleasure in welcoming you to tonight's forum. Before beginning, I've been asked to draw your attention to GIBS's upcoming forum, which is our year-end foresight forum, the details of which you can find in the program. We're glad that tonight's forum is being live streamed on GIBS's Facebook page, and please feel free to tweet about it. The Twitter handle you will find in your program. Since its launch in May of last year, the Ethics and Governance think tank has been engaged in a wide range of different activities. One of them has been the development of a national conversation about ethics, and our fora have featured remarkable South African leaders. 3 of them, though, stand out because of their extraordinary moral courage and their commitment to do what is right in the face of enormous pressure. Nhlanhla Nene, whom we hosted in September of last year, Mcebisi Jonas, whom we hosted in March of this year, and of course, Pravin Gordhan. It's a privilege and an honor to host you tonight. Pravin Gordhan has famously encouraged South Africans to join the dots. On one level, this has to do with engaging in a systemic analysis of our situation, of understanding the central and underlying problem, and not just focusing on what appear to be its sporadic and disconnected manifestations. This seems to be something which is happening more and more, including through the uncovering of the role of certain companies in state capture and corruption. But as I understand it, at least, join the dots has a wider implication. It's also about collaboration between diverse societal stakeholders to achieve collective impact. It's about South Africans working together, despite the seriousness of their differences, in pursuit of ethical leadership and transformation, of institutional integrity, and of inclusive growth. We can perhaps relate this challenge to a different and striking idea. In any ethical and well-functioning society, you have to have a degree of guilt and of shame, as unattractive as those words might sound. Now, there's a fundamental difference between guilt and shame, as the great anthropologist Ruth Benedict demonstrated in the late 1940s. In shame cultures, morality is defined and driven by what others expect of us. What deters or discourages us from behaving unethically is the fear of shame, the disapproval, the disgrace, and the humiliation that we'll experience if other people find out what we've done. So shame is related to social conformity and control. In guilt cultures, ethical behavior doesn't depend on the attitudes and perceptions of others, but on our intrinsic understanding of how we ought to behave, on us doing what is right because it is right. In such a culture, people freely choose to behave in accordance with their internalized moral precepts. So guilt is the inner disturbance that we experience when we behave in a way that goes against what we know is right. Shame is about public image or societal expectation. Guilt is about the voice of our own conscience. Shame is directed towards the other. Guilt is inner-directed. Now, in an ideal society, behavior would be directed by each person's moral compass. They'd be motivated by their own consciences, as in a culture of guilt. But where this kind of ethical maturity is lacking, a sense of shame can also prevent ethical failure. In our hyper-connected and transparent world, the potential for shame is magnified, as we've seen in the scandals engulfing Bell Pottinger, KPMG, McKinsey, SAP, and others. Now, of course, public shaming raises troubling ethical questions around the violation of human privacy and dignity. But shaming can enable people to challenge powerful individuals and organizations and hold them to account. It's perhaps the fear of appearing on the front page of the Sunday Times that deters some corporate leaders from behaving badly. So where does South Africa stand? Well, the problem we have, as I argued in a piece in the Business Day a few months ago, is that some of our leaders have no sense of guilt, nor even a sense of shame. They seem to lack a moral compass and a conscience, the source from which a sense of guilt arises, but they also seem to be arrogantly indifferent and brazen, unmoved by any sense of shame, without any sensitivity to what others will think when their bad behavior is revealed. They refuse to resign despite the public exposure of their dishonesty, corruption, and incompetence. And this is seen, of course, in one crisis and scandal after the other, involving government departments and SOEs. It's this spirit of shamelessness which, perhaps above all else, undermines the ethical foundations of our society and threatens our future. But as we all know, we also have leaders who have extraordinary moral courage, who, because of their unbending moral compasses, have defied all sorts of fearsome pressures and threats in the service of our country. This should inspire us all during this time of anxiety in South Africa, and it should inspire us in whatever sphere of influence we operate to also do the right thing and to join the dots, to work together with our fellow South Africans in the struggle against shamelessness and in support of ethical leadership and transformation. I now invite Pravin to address us, after which Professor Nick Benadel, the previous Dean of GIBS, will facilitate a conversation with him. Pravin.
Well, good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation to be unable to lecture to you like he did. I could sit here for another hour and listen to you. It will be wonderful to learn about those sorts of concepts and how they apply in our kind of situation. And thanks to all of you for finding time after, I'm sure, a busy day to attend a 1-hour session here. There's no doubt that if you take the concepts of ethics, shame, and guilt, that not only in South Africa but in the globe today, there's a crisis of significant proportions. Because today you still have language being used like leaders of the free world. I thought the whole world was more or less free. And regrettably, we also are moving towards the whole world becoming relatively unfree as a result of election results in some part of the world. You, I'm sure, get the drift. Do you? Or you're too tired? And that crisis and the lack of shame and guilt is one that is reflected in the levels of inequality in society, notwithstanding the kind of historical progress that we've made, where economists like Larry Summers, I think recently talking somewhere in the US, correctly pointed out to the kind of convergence that has taken place between developing countries and developed countries and people in those respective countries on, say, a 100-year scale. But notwithstanding that, you still have 1,250 odd billionaires controlling, $6 trillion of wealth. You still have most countries in a situation where more than 50% of their national wealth, like South Africa, is held either by 5% or 10% of the population. And most working people still find themselves in most parts of the world at a huge disadvantage in terms of the increases in their income, or to put it on the reverse side, the stagnant incomes, which then give us the politics of populism that we've seen and the consequences of that populism as reflected in elections in different parts of the world. And there's a lot of thinking and talking happening now about the inadequacy of the current economic models, some of which works, whether you call it neoliberal or whatever it is, and much of which doesn't work, particularly with the introduction of technology as a key factor and driver of change, which impacts on society and people. But also, I think, with the introduction of Pope Francis on the scene, a very strong reminder, whether you're Catholic or not, and I'm not, of what social justice means and how you bring social justice into the equation of economics or business or indeed governance and government as well. And I think it's that kind of context that we then examine our own situation in South Africa and reflect on our own crisis, which also is a crisis of governance. It certainly is a crisis of ethics, but it's also a crisis in terms of relative levels of wealth and income in our society. It's a crisis which is reflected in the fact that after 23 years of democracy, we haven't quite got rid of the structural features of apartheid that impact on our society, whether it's the massive exclusion of black people from the economy, whether it is the spatial nature and arrangement of our cities, the levels of concentration in different parts of our economy, the disparity in terms of asset ownership by the majority of South Africans versus those of us that are black or white in the middle classes in our society, and you can go on. But it is in that kind of context that democracy has created an environment where the other phenomenon, which I'd like you to perhaps express your view on later on if we get a chance, where does rent seeking, both legitimate rent seeking and illegitimate rent seeking or excessive rent seeking, fit into the shame and guilt paradigm that you've actually just shared with us? Because it is excessive rent seeking, the politics of patronage, what we in common language call corruption, but corruption on a systemic scale, which results in what we today talk about as a state capture in our own society. And I think the concepts of shame and guilt and the lack of shame and guilt as we see it, and one clear, simple example is the whole scandal and tragedy around the payment of social grants in South Africa, where an issue that concerns 17 million people out of the 55 million people that is our population is, what do you want to call it, bumped around between courts and government institutions, and you can see deliberate obfuscation, you can see deliberate fabrications as reasons why X can't be done and Y can't be done, even to the extent where the highest court in the land has to now essentially become a grant administrator to ensure that 17 million people a couple of months from now will still be guaranteed that their grants will be actually paid to them. And what lies below it is the collective attraction, both in the private sector and in the public sector, of the greed factor. Because part of the systemic issues that we have to deal with in the 21st century is how do we deal with greed? Because materialism and consumerism and the lack of shame and guilt allows for unprecedented and unrestrained greed to be a key driver, both in the public sector in terms of stealing, and let's be less polite now, and in the private sector in terms of the assembling of profits, of bonuses, of commissions, particularly in the financial sector, and what that does to the quality of mindsets and the quality of business ethics and government ethics in the way we actually see it. So one of the questions we then get confronted with is the one that Mr. Lennon, who might not be your most popular person, but as young activists we learned this little question from him: what is to be done? And guilt and shame are certainly two important drivers. But when guilt and shame are accompanied, as you correctly pointed out, Rabbi, by arrogance and one other factor, impunity, then guilt and shame actually become shamefully a declining factor in the overall balance. And what we see when those in power behave, or the arrogant and those who behave with impunity have their hands on the levers of power, whether that is corporate power or the power of government or the levers of government, then you have a toxic mix that you're actually dealing with. And you need to bring that into the equation when you're asking the question, what is to be done? So as there might be a few UDF-style activists in the audience here, let me say what we would have done and have done in the 1980s and why it is relevant today. I know there's one famous trade unionist, at least in the audience as well, so that's a good sign. But we're finding ourselves in a situation where, let me repeat, shame and guilt per se aren't going to shift those who behave arrogantly in power. What is going to shift them is societal mobilization. What is going to shift society to be mobilized is a keener awareness going beyond just the connection of dots about how do systems like this work, and how does both the politics and the economics and the behavioral dimensions and dynamics work to actually inform the kind of rent-seeking and patronage processes, or again, putting it most simply, the stealing and neglecting processes actually work. So how do we become more aware citizens? How do we become mobilized into some kind of action? Because one of the missing factors that we see more recently is what we saw in 2016, where civil society was very active. All of us were very concerned about developments that were going on in government. And as a result of that, I should thank you on behalf of the two other co-charged people with me in 2016 for not being in jail now. So thank you very much. Or not landing ultimately truly in the hands of Sean Abrams. But the third factor which became important in our history is levels of organization. And again, the extent to which society is organized and is then able to shame people is the extent to which you have a better power balance between those who hold corporate power or those who hold political power and abuse either of those powers as far as citizens' interests are concerned. And the proposition that I'm putting forward for debate tonight is that a higher level of awareness, a higher level of mobilization, and getting more people organized in civil society and elsewhere places us in a better position to resist the abuse of power, places us in a better position to shame people, like the companies that you've actually mentioned, because they still do believe, by the way, in my interactions with some of those companies, that because they're global, South Africa doesn't really matter. Because they're global, they don't actually have to worry about the lives that they've messed up here or the institutions that they've messed up, far more importantly. And so a lot more needs to be done to make some of those organizations much more aware about the social damage that they've caused and the reputational and institutional damage that they've caused than they currently acknowledge to those that they have injured, which includes all of us in a sense as well. So the critical question is how do we actually engage in forms of activity or struggle or resistance which will ensure that this doesn't become a runaway train, that this doesn't become so acute a problem in South Africa as I think in some minds it is, and I've said this, I'm afraid, to several audiences, so I'm going to say it again here, that the upper middle classes in South Africa, black or white, are thinking about where the next million rands or dollars needs to be kept so that it is safe, and who's going to get it out for them, and what commission is going to be charged for getting the money out. Let's be frank, that's some of the conversation that's going on. The other conversation that's going on is, are my children safe here? And are they going to be properly educated here? Or do I need to take them somewhere else to be actually educated? And that is also a conversation I can see from some of the nodding heads that is beginning to happen. But what should accompany that, and I submit that respectfully, is rather a conversation about how do we resist corruption? How do we resist the abuse of power? How do we actually contribute towards revitalizing the vision that we have, for example, in the National Development Plan, of the kind of South Africa that we actually want? And how do we all become active in one way or another to contribute to the realization of those plans, and more importantly, contribute to shifting the balance in the right kind of way? And that brings me to contemporary politics, which is probably going to be my last point. And that is, what has all this got to do with the December ANC elections? Before you ask me, I'll tell you. Because I'm sure that's the other preoccupation that all of us have. And in particular, I want to point you to and bring your attention to the speech that the Deputy President Ramaphosa made a few days ago in Soweto, where he outlined a new deal for the economy of South Africa and some of the key elements that actually accompany it. Now, what all of this has to do with the ANC conference in December is that the ANC is still the most popular organization as an organization amongst the vast majority of South Africans. That's a fact of life. That doesn't mean that everybody accepts the current leadership of the ANC, but as a brand, as an organization, and as a legend, if you like, it's in the hearts, it's embedded in the hearts of the majority of South Africans like you can't believe. And I've been saying to some monetarily well-endowed people, that's a nice euphemism, that they can donate as much as they like to some of the other organizations. That shift is not going to take place in the hearts of the majority of South Africans. But what the majority of South Africans do want is a change in the leadership of the ANC. They want a change which will show that this organization is capable, as it was capable of bringing South Africa beyond 1994, is capable of leading South Africa towards a different economy, a more cohesive society, a socially just society, a society that actually begins to live the values enshrined in our Constitution. And those sorts of things don't emerge easily. So there's a very real contest going on for essentially, on the one hand, approximately continuing the current trajectory of things that are happening with some modifications, or on the other hand, seeing a radical change in the way that the country is being run, a radical change in the way the economy is actually operating, and how transformation is actually being embedded in our society as well. And those essentially are the choices. But as you know quite well, those who have had the privilege of holding power, exercising power, and benefiting from that power, whether in the corporate sector, but in this instance in the political sector, don't give it up easily. Partly because some people know they're going to end in jail sometime next year if there's a change in December, because of what they've done. So obviously they're going to fight like hell to ensure that they don't end up in jail. And partly because there's a lot more of the billion, 100 billion or 200 billion that has left the country through the state-owned entities. There's many other entities that also have money that needs to be taken to Dubai and Hong Kong, and where else is it? I'm sure some of you know. So that process must be allowed to continue, and for that process to continue, the current political arrangement, as the lawyers will say, mutandis, with some changes, need to continue as well. On the other hand, the Ramaphosa campaign is actually saying we need to move in a radically different trajectory. State capture must be contested. The captured state must be recaptured by the people of South Africa to serve the real purpose of the Constitution and the National Development Plan. And a new deal means essentially that the focus can't be on how do I use state institutions to get money for myself and my friends, but state institutions are there to ensure that the private sector in South Africa thrives, that all South Africans have a significant increase in their standard of living, that all South Africans have assets in their hands to pass on to the next generation. Today, the vast majority of South Africans are not in that position. They pass on poverty, they don't pass on assets to the next generations. And that's a shameful thing. So if you want to talk about shame, then we have a collective shame in South Africa, that after 23 years, the vast majority of South Africans still don't have assets in their hands. It's a shame that 6 to 7 million black youth or young people are still walking the streets of South Africa, unemployed, untrained, relatively educated, but no hope of a job. Right? But there's some answers that we're beginning to develop, both as government and the private sector and the trade unions. So I've got some friends in the audience that I will call on. Let me prepare them as they're doing their SMSs. To add to my lonely voice here. And essentially, the New Deal is saying Let's use the state for different purposes. Let's get a sense of unity of purpose amongst all of us. Let's put a leadership in place that is decisive, that is clear, that is going to energize all of us to become part of this process of transformation. And above all, take the decisions that are necessary and implement them effectively and quickly and with a sense of urgency so that we very quickly in the new year can begin to see the country moving in a different direction, increase business confidence, increase consumer confidence. You don't then have to worry about where your next million needs to be kept. You can leave it here and don't have to worry about your children going elsewhere. They'll be here to look after you when you're getting older. So that's the proposition broadly that we are talking about. There's 10 key components that it identifies. I won't bore you with that right now. But obviously crucial amongst those components is how do we achieve inclusive growth through radical economic transformation. And this is not a populist slogan. Radical means deep changes. And clearly, if we don't make deep changes in the city, the way cities are designed and develop at the moment, we're not going to see us becoming one society. We're still an alienated society. Different communities still live in a partition kind of way, notwithstanding what the Constitution actually says. So we've got to get this new element of inclusivity and cohesion. That in itself must give us higher growth levels. But that growth levels as GDP numbers must be in a form that actually benefits all South Africans and where everybody can actually see where those benefits are impacting on them in a positive kind of way. A complaint that so-called middle-class people and working people in their hundreds of millions have across the globe, that globalization has just benefited a small elite, it hasn't benefited large percentages of people in most societies as well. But eventually, that kind of dynamism has to produce jobs that can actually absorb the unemployed people that we have. But we also need an education and skills system that produces people of far higher skills than we do currently, notwithstanding the good work that this institution does, so that our economy can, over the next 10 or 15 years, reach greater heights in terms of innovation, research, and technological and digital creativity than we might have reached at this particular point in time. And all of this can be seen to be beneficial to all sections of society so that we have a stake in the kind of way in which the economy grows, society advances, and South Africa moves along the more optimistic and let's call it the high road trajectory that we all hope we can actually put in place. So, in sum, we are saying we have a very urgent task ahead of us as South Africans. Recapture the captured state, firstly. Secondly, those of us that are in the ANC, we want to see the right outcome in December. Thirdly, we need to develop a common purpose along the lines that I'm actually talking about. And fourthly, all of us need to ask the question, how can I contribute to this particular process and not just remain passengers? And fifthly, much of what I'm talking about just doesn't apply to government and politicians. It applies to all of us as citizens of South Africa who need to become active participants in this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pravin, for doing two things that I think we've got to know you for in this course of this year. The one is to provide a broad analysis of where we are, and the other is to challenge us. So I'm going to ask a few questions, then we're going to open it up to you. But I think you've come tonight not only to hear the wisdom and experience of a man that's played an extraordinary role in our country and is still playing that role, but also to kind of reflect a bit in the mirror and ask about our own role as we end this year and think about how do we rebuild and capture the potential this country still has within it. You started a lot of your political life as an activist. And in a sense, you're an activist again. You've been at the pinnacle of power in government, occupying one of the most important portfolios, and not an easy one in any country, to be Dr. No. which is to say no to the many demands on a budget.
But it's a portfolio from which most people get fired as well.
One way or the other. In your case, extraordinarily. But let me start by asking you just to kind of go back to the 80s and take yourself back to activism, because you raised this question about in 2016 civil society seemed to be quite active. Have we lost our way a bit? What triggers do you think? What triggered in you? I think that we probably know. But what would you say from your experience triggers this kind of commitment to take action that goes beyond the day-to-day interests of a society? What triggers that?
I think it's a variety of factors. In those days, and I'm sure it applies in some instances amongst the younger people today, it's intellectual and ideological, usually when you're younger. And then as you get grayer and bolder, you lose some of the edge on the ideological side. Secondly, it's a sense of moral outrage at what might be happening. So in those days, non-European, European, you can't play here, you can play there. You have to walk 5 kilometers before you can play soccer on a green patch, in my case, but in other cases even worse. And different forms of discrimination are seen as and viewed as unjust. In yet other cases, an identification with workers and workers' struggles. In yet other cases, citizens or residents in particular areas who are grappling against eviction notices and very excessive rent increases and other problems in community areas. There's a few people here in the audience who've been very active in that particular regard. But all of that has to be eventually connected to a political framework, which A, explains why these particular things are happening, B, increases the level of political consciousness so that one can interpret events differently, not in a fragmented form. So that was also a period of connecting dots, but in a different kind of way. Today is a much more complex situation than in those days. We didn't worry too much about the world. We saw Russia as a very positive force, which it was in those days. I'm not sure now, but that's a different matter. And that then propels you into action. And action then shows that, you can start being a catalyst for local leadership developing, for trade union shop stewards developing, for community leaders developing, and a level of politicization then happens in each of these kinds of contexts.
Let me ask you, if I go to exclusive books, to the non-fiction South African section, there must be 80 books, the latest Jacques Pauw's book that many people have read. Do you think that
By the way, I wrote that, you know that, eh?
Congratulations. Do you think we're miscalculating our interests? We have the information, the emails, all these stories. Why aren't we taking more action? Let me try and sharpen that. You're calling on us to, why aren't we taking more action? Do we miscalculate?
I don't know. There was some would say, and I have on my left here Mandla Nkomfe, who's also a very experienced activist in the UDF, in the ANC, and latterly MEC for Finance, so he's got government experience in Gauteng as well, and currently involved with civil society. So I said I'll get him into trouble this evening, so he can help to answer that question. And there's 2 trade unionists, one sitting in front, one sitting at the back, one ex, one current, so they could help. Why are we not acting? I think there was a kind of demobilization, inverted commas, around the early 90s. ANC is here, liberation is here, we can relax, leave it to them. Secondly, citizens normally would say, leave it to the government or leave it to the politicians, they will handle things. Thirdly, activism isn't a culture that permeates every community in South Africa, because we're all in different partitions in the past. And yet each of the communities in South Africa did produce activists as well. But the base on which they operated was different in terms of size and effect. There isn't the same clarity about who's the enemy. In the anti-apartheid days, clear, the system is the enemy. Get rid of the system and fight it in as many ways as you can. Today, who is the enemy? Or what is the enemy? And we will each define it in different kinds of ways. And perhaps yet we're not angry enough yet, because if you middle class and above, you can live in your zone, in your cocoon, and none of this can necessarily affect you. But they are on the ground, so to speak, in communities and so on, and my other colleagues here can come in on this. There's an anger, there's a sense of disappointment, but there's also a sense of expectation that this problem will be resolved in December. But can I invite, if you don't mind, Mandla to say a few words?
Sure. No, I think...
You want to stand up? Oh, there's a mic.
Oh. We've got to differentiate between the ANC and the general populace as such. And it seems to me that in the last 18 months, there has been a resurgence of activism, and largely via civil society organizations and the judiciary and all that. So there we find. But I think it goes back to the point that Pravin raised earlier on, that the ANC remains quite a very dominant organization across. And the problem is that whereas everything is happening outside the ANC, but inside the ANC, there's a sense of not moving, because there's a sense of fear, and that's why a lot of expectation is put on December. Until such time that you activate the ANC itself, you will see quite a number of developments that will be taking place. But largely, my sense is that there's a greater mobilization, there's a greater conscientization. What is required at the levels of organization now on the ground that will be able to carry this upsurge, as it were.
Very good. Seeing as you're outsourcing, I thought I'd give Dennis George an opportunity to speak, maybe from a union point of view, and then I'll come back to you. Dennis?
Thanks. Look, I think we must give our people hope, and we must give our young people a vision for the future. Because, I mean, December month is going to come, and the ANC must make a decision. But when you look to unite the nation, now if you look at the numbers, now countries like China and India invested 30% of GDP in the economy. Our number stands at 19.5%. You can't keep the money in your pocket and think poverty is going to disappear or unemployment is going to disappear. It cannot. And so therefore a person needs to now project to say, look, we have an agreement in terms of the National Development Plan that said that we need to create 11 million jobs by 2030. And that's only 12 months or 12 years away. So in terms of the proposal that you were making about the statement that Cyril made in Soweto, that is what we must embrace. We cannot become angry, we cannot become sad. And the point is, let's become activists. So the good news is this: business and labor have agreed in NEDLAC, they're going to take on 1 million young people from next year, 330,000. That was one of Pravin's objectives until they shot him, out of cabinet. The other thing is this, Pravin took us to New York, He never told me, Dennis, we're going to ask you to speak to the investors. I mean, I was the only one to quote Karl Marx in New York. I mean, you could imagine those capitalists were like running. But we explained to them that our mission is still to lift the poor up out of that. You know, because what can you do with the money when you die? You can't take it with you. And so therefore, I think we need a new partnership for the future. We need to know the people that's going to vote, let them do that, but let us build the building blocks in. Because South Africa is a beautiful country. Yesterday was a bit sad about the rugby. I think we must teach Saru not to rest on their laurels. You must not only just get a report, but you must canvass the people to vote for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. So, you made some comments about business. We've seen an uptick in business leadership, South Africa being more outspoken. You and Jabu Mabuza led the CEO initiative. Any other comments about where you think business can, not at the level of us, but at the level of institutional involvement? How do you rate what's happened this year?
I think in 2016, partly out of self-interest, partly a kind of emerging national interest and identification with that, we built a remarkable partnership. And key in that partnership is a level of trust, that we can work with each other, we can talk the same language. Dennis in New York, could be the Minister of Finance in terms of how he was articulating the South African case. So it was nice to see some of the richest people sitting at the same table with us, with the trade unionists and ourselves, and we all saying the same things in defense of this country, and basically asking ratings agencies and people invested in South Africa to say, we'll work our way out of 9/12, trust us, and they believed us for the better part of 2016 until the next knock comes along. So, Rabbi, you need to tell us, why do people become self-destructive? When you know that you're on a good path, things are going to work and become better, and then you self-destruct. But to come back to your question, I think there's a deeper transformation that the business leaders who have been involved up to now need to lead and need to agitate for, so that ceilings that exist in different forms for women, for blacks, for young, aspiring people, are cracked in some way. Secondly, there needs to be, at a middle management level, an equal transformation effort as well. So having the top personnel becoming more and more aware and party to the kind of things that Dennis has been talking about and Nwandla has been involved in on the civil society side. We've got to deepen transformation, deepen the understanding of what non-racialism and non-sexism means. At the moment, generally the word transformation strikes fear, or apprehension at least, in most of the white population, for example, because that's the connotation it's been given. But if you approach it with a clear head, what we do need is a massive transformation in South Africa, not just in a color sense, but we need a whole new economic dynamism. You need to produce a generation of entrepreneurs that are going to give us startups that will give us a competitive edge into the future. We've got fascinating problems to solve, where if the best brains from all the sectors come together, I believe we'll crack them, we'll find innovative solutions, and that's what business schools, by the way, should be spending half their time on, forgive me. But in looking at our own problems and saying, where are the answers? Apart from, the algorithms that we want to get involved in to maximize profits by manipulating, as some people do, LIBOR rates or J-bar rates or whatever the thing is called. I've seen tables where there's a minuscule difference between A and B, but when you multiply it by 1 billion, it makes a big difference. And that's what we spend all of our lives trying to do. to accomplish what Dennis is actually talking about. So there's a culture change that I think can be embraced a lot more. And there's a new form of solidarity that is required. Solidarity which says, it might cost me more to bring 3 young people and give them experience for a year as part of that youth employment scheme that we are talking about. But it's okay. I'll take the cost factor because this will change their lives, because this will give them a CV for the first time in their lives. And the academic studies show, having got your first job, the rest becomes a little bit easier. In fact, significantly easier. That's the worldwide experience. But we're stuck, we're paralyzed, we're frozen. So apart from becoming activists who put on their walking shoes and march down whichever street you prefer, this is a form of activism as well. It's a form which says, let me be proactive. Let me be, and that's where the consciousness, the C part that I was talking about earlier comes in. Are we aware of the depth of the problems we have that we as this generation or generations of people need to help to solve? Mandela's generation solved one big problem. Ours is another set. Are we willing to take some responsibility for it? That's the question.
And it's primarily an economic challenge were you referring to. How deep is state capture? So we make the assumption we can reverse this process. You've had an eyeball, an eagle's eye view and experience. How deep is state capture?
Let's put it this way, it's extensive in the sense that it covers so many institutions, from institutions that are supposed to be law enforcement agencies, to fiscal institutions, to the state-owned entities, to certain government departments which are supposed to watch over one of these or the other agencies. And when you have your revenue administration in the wrong hands, and remember, one of the proudest things that we've done under Minister Manuel is to build up both the Treasury and the SARS outfit to a level where 95% or more of our expenditure came from our own tax base. Right? We're unlike most developing countries in the world. We've never been to the IMF or anybody for a package. In fact, we're so ideologically opposed. We should be borrowing money cheaply from the World Bank, but we're very hesitant to borrow because of the kind of ideological connotations that it has. And there was an interesting phrase coined during that time, fiscal sovereignty, apart from political sovereignty. And we are risking our fiscal sovereignty because a group of gangsters want to put their hands on the billions that belong to South Africans.
R.W. Johnson sat where you were a little while ago when he wrote this.
I want to change my seat, you know.
He said we'll be going to the IMF within 2 years. That was 18 months ago. Do you think we could get there?
We could get there if we continue to make bad choices, but within 2 days you can begin to make the right choices and begin a journey on a completely different direction. So it's not a difficult proposition where you have to move Mount Himalaya to South Africa or something like that.
So we've got we are a democratic society, we've got a strong constitution, we've got an independent judiciary, a free media with all of its different perspectives. We've got a big middle class, we've got strong business. So you're saying we can turn quite quickly. It's about confidence and taking action.
And leadership.
And we can reverse state capture.
Yeah, and leadership. So somebody has got to get to the top as a team and begin to say, I or we shall approach issues of governance and issues of business and issues of labor in a different way. And we will take it in this direction versus that direction. So, you know, some people by their very nature are cynics about everything that happens in this country. And they're negative about everything that we do in this country. Now, that's not the history many of us come from. We're optimists by nature. We are strugglers, if you like, by nature. And you do the best you can if you have the right kind of perspective, and then leave it to the next generation to carry on.
As you think back to 86, 88, and you compare it to 2016, 2017, I mean, we're much better off in the sense that we are a democracy.
Yes.
It's an open society. We can make the choices as a free society.
No, and we've changed people's lives
And
quite
we've
significantly.
changed millions of people's lives. And that should give us a foundation.
So the momentum is there. The problem is there's a whole lot of people who want to drive it in a different direction or interrupt the flow.
Why should they give up?
Why they should give up?
We know morally why they should give up.
No, they
But in
will.
terms of
they,
power.
they must give up because we're going to beat them.
Okay.
Otherwise, they're not going to give up.
Very good. Let me open it up now. We've got about 20 minutes. Let me open it up, and we're going to take 2 or 3 questions at a time. Let me encourage you to be as direct as you can. If you wouldn't mind just saying your name, and please ask your question. So I have some
Dave at the back.
lady here, and I see another hand. Are people just twitching? There's a gentleman there, and Dave Lewis. So please, let's start with you. Go ahead.
Hi there, my name is Sandra. I'd like to find out, there seems to be a very big difference between the way that the corporates that have been involved in state capture and have been implicated. There seems to be a difference between the way that they have responded and the way that we've held them to account, so organized business, etc. So what do we do to hold the others to account? So the ESCOMs, the Transnets, the SOEs, SARS, etc., etc. What do we do?
Lovely, that's one. Gentleman there in the blue shirt.
Thank you. Mr. Gordhan, my question is, during your term as a minister...
Sorry, where are you? Oh, okay. Your tax number, please?
Yes. My question is, during the time as a minister, there was negotiations around triple PFA, which is 30% needs to go to the black businesses or the that comes from the government. So during that time, it was not actually stipulated on what percentage actually needs to go to the youth, because I think that's where we're sitting with the problem of exclusion. If you don't put things in percentage, it becomes difficult for youth to go and actually ask for work from the government.
Thanks very much. And if we can move the mic, sorry, I should have taken both questions over there. If you can just, sorry to get you running.
Don't have another mic.
No, we don't.
Thank you. My name is David Lewis. You know, we arrived at 1994 from a combination of the pressure applied by the UDF leadership, which I think was the internal leadership of the ANC, by civil society organizations and by the unions. And we got, in consequence, the government that we wanted. And then some of us headed off for government, and others headed off to do well in business, and others just went home. And we frankly landed up with a government that we deserved. And I think that we forgot that a government is only as good as its citizens are demanding. So then we've finally woken up over the last couple of years, and civil society has become active. And you know, one of the most gratifying changes over the last year or two is the extent to which business has come to the party. So we have a very active source of pressure on government that I don't doubt will triumph. I mean, I feel a bit like 1988 when you can actually see the sort of light on the horizon. Maybe because things are so dark, we'll triumph, but we still have a way to go. And civil society organizations that have been at the forefront of this need to be supported. And you'll hear where I'm coming to in a minute. They need desperately to be supported, and they need desperately not to be demobilized after the victory is won. The leadership of civil society and of the unions should not be immediately going into government or going into business or going home, as we did in 1994, and completely demobilized the kind of pressure that is needed to hold government to account. And, you know, I find, you know, in the civil society sort of space at the moment, a remarkable lack of support from the middle class, from the large South African middle class and generally very well endowed South African middle class, which is very well represented in this room. And you know, you need to ask, so how can you support civil society organizations? Well, I'm gross enough to tell you that one way that you could do it is you could go onto the Corruption Watch website and you could see a big orange button there that says donate now. And, you know, this is a way of supporting civil society organizations, all of whom are really, really resource constrained and who have brought you to the stage now where you can start to think about a much better place to come yet again. But I find that, you know, the support that we get is either from very, very rich people or from very, very poor people. But it very rarely comes from middle-class people, with, in our case, I have to say, the single exception of the law profession, which has been, in fact, very, very generous to us and other civil society organizations. But I think it's something that everybody needs to think about. And I mean, in a sense, Pravin said that, is how can we as individuals with resources, and they may be resources in kind, they may be resources in cash, how can we support the civil society organizations that have brought us to where we are now and that will hold the next government to account if they're not demobilized very quickly?
Thanks very much for that comment, Dave. Do you want to pick up?
Let's take one or two more.
Yeah, let's take a few more questions. Let me just say, Barbara Tushman wrote a wonderful book called The March of Folly. She said, folly is what happens when you miscalculate your own interests, knowing better. And I look at our neighbor in the north, it's a great case of folly. We know, that's why I mentioned exclusive books. None of us can say we don't know what has happened. So thank you for that comment. Gentleman here, and then can I see and the lady at the back? And the forest of hands. Where? You're pointing to someone over here. We'll come to
yes, my name is Sibo from SA Taxi. I'm an IT, so my question is primarily around something that's key to all of us. What's the backup plan if everything fails in December?
None of us are going on holiday. That's the answer. Please go ahead.
So my name is Sabine Del Omo. I'm the CEO of Siemens, and I would like to comment to the comment of Corruption Watch, because who knows, Siemens knows that in 2007 we had a massive corruption scandal in our company, which led to about 800 million euro fine we had to pay to German authorities and to the Department of Justice in the US. Total cost of working on that whole corruption aspect was for the company about 2 billion euro. So there are many, many reasons for international companies, first of all, to be compliant, because when you get caught out, it is very expensive. And you have to find customers who pay for that at the end of the day. Right, but one thing our CEO at that time negotiated with the Department of Justice in the US, and I think that is something specifically in the South African context which will help, is that a portion of the fine of the 630 million we had to pay to the US, we only paid in cash 200 million. 430 million we could keep as a kind of integrity fund, which we also use for awareness campaigns specifically for society, predominantly in Africa with universities, with cities, with various institutions. Here in South Africa we work closely with the Ethics Institute, of which we basically create awareness to what is conflict of interest, why ethical business is important to society. And I think it's something what we could do in South Africa, because if somebody pays to the Competition Commission, that money goes to SARS, that money is available to steal. And secondly, you just, yeah, to give them basically the money back, also you have to be caught out. But also as a company, and coming back to what Pravin Gordhan says, is how do we can change the society is, as a company, when you have to run with it now for 10 years, you have to make sure that you talk about compliance all the time, because you have to run this as initiatives. It's not done with a payment. So it's a legacy. So I would recommend that as an option for South Africa.
Thank you for sharing that with us, and thank you for your contribution. Was there someone here that...
Yeah, gentleman.
Please go ahead. Okay,
Okay.
then we'll come here.
Thanks very much. Hi, Pravin. Honourable Ambassador Robbie is the name. And my question is, I hear what David Lewis says about supporting organizations like that, but what's going through, and I can relate very much to civil activism as a concept. But specifically, my question is, what do we as individuals do tomorrow when we go about our business to give effect to what we're all trying to achieve?
I thought you were going to give us your answer. All right, maybe that's why we've come together. Let's take this question, and then maybe you'd like to respond too.
Thanks. My name is Bradley. Ms. Gordhan, there's been comments about civil society, and I think my question is closer to that gentleman's. I think of civil society as formal organizations, which I actually think South Africa does very well. If you look at business, civil, and government, I think civil society is actually doing the best job if it comes to authentic leadership and standing up for what's right. The question for me is the active citizenship that groundswell. How do we get that going? Maybe we didn't even have enough of it 30, 40 years ago. But now, Trevor Manuel was saying we need active citizenship when he wrote the NDP. And now that we've realized that we've been held hostage, are we really seeing that? And how do we get that going? I think you understand South Africa quite well. How do we get that going, and how do we keep it going?
Great, thanks, Bradley. Pravin, I'm going to take that lady over there, and Abdullah next to her, and then I'll give the floor to you, and we'll begin to wrap up.
Thank you. My name is Roshima. I'm from Bank, and my question relates to how deep is state capture. So my question would be, how many people do you think need to be arrested the day after Cyril wins? And how many of those people are in the NEC? And so what possibility is there of them getting arrested and Cyril still being president? Thank you.
So a short question, Pravin Gordhan. I think there's been a heightened level of activism, be it from civil society or business, in the last 18 months. But we've had 23 years of democracy, of which the majority of that has had significant economic growth. And that economic growth, unfortunately, hasn't had a systemic impact on the majority of our society. 7 million youth you speak about, largely black youth who are unemployed. The majority of our people in rural areas haven't had and seen the fruits of democracy. And so my question is, post-December, let's say Cyril Ramaphosa comes in and there's a new deal. The new deal can't be a deal only for government to be able to carry the mantle of really saying, how do we create inclusive economic growth? And so how do we get an energized society, not only civil society, but broader society, to be able to understand and internalize the real challenges that we have in South Africa, and move away from these lagers that we have, where we have phenomenal lifestyles of certain individuals that live in certain pockets of society, and 2 kilometers down the road we have people who have real vexing challenges. Because if we can get that activism, that should we create an inclusive, prosperous society for 55, 56 million South Africans.
Thanks so much. Do you want to pick up on those? And
yeah, and that the last point is precisely the point that, I mean, if I follow through with my temptation, you know what I would say? Can you guys talk to your neighbors, please, and come up with 2 solutions to what we're talking about? That'll get you involved. See, right now you are just observers, and you've listened and you'll go home. Whereas at least you've talked to the 4 people around you. Time is a bit of a problem, but can I?
Yeah.
Can you do that?
Let's do it.
What are you going to do tomorrow?
Let's take 3 minutes. It's the end of a year.
Talk to your neighbors.
Think about 2018. What are you going to do? Good job. So we're going to Deputy, we're going to wrap. So comment on any of the questions on Plan B and...
Yeah, I'll answer some of them.
Yeah.
And we'll just take a sample.
Sorry?
We'll take a sample of the answers.
Okay.
Let me not waste this bottle. Look at the buzz. You should live stream this.
They are. Here's the camera. Are you picking this discussion up? No, they're doing it. I'll let it go for another minute. We do 60 forums a year. Half of them are about politics and the economy. 4,000 people a year.
Yo.
Done 800 since we started. So because the minister's a Democrat, he's going to ask you to make a few comments. So who'd like to start?
So this is what an activist forum looked like in the 1980s. I'm serious.
And that's while you were speaking.
And if you could hear yourselves, it's amazing.
Fantastic.
The amount of energy you just generated in 5 minutes.
So the gentleman that's sitting next to me is in insurance. And what I would like to see is a commitment from business not to do business with anyone who is associated with President Zuma or the Guptas. So what the life insurance people could do, for example, is say, we will not cover the lives of anyone involved with those people.
Next question, next suggestion.
Hi, I'm Wendy Dobson from Standard Bank. And a view that I hold strongly is that business is culpable for the situation that we're in now. That may be a controversial view in this particular room, because post-GEAR, it missed an opportunity. It got what it wanted, in a way. It got a conservative fiscal and monetary policy, and it conceded a few things in the labor relations space and BE. And then it pulled out of politics and went about thinking it was business as usual and didn't really engage on issues of social justice. So to bring that back to what business can do, business needs to rethink how it measures its performance and what its real purpose is. In business ethics, we talk about that the purpose of business is to meet the needs of people, and people are willing to pay an acceptable price for that, and those are our customers, and that's why we exist. We exist for our customers, not our shareholders. Now, there are millions and millions of South Africans out there who have pressing needs that if business was more socially innovative, we could meet those needs and still make money and still make profit. But we measure business on return on equity or share price. So what we're doing in Standard Bank is we've adopted a new model called C, which stands for Social, Economic, and Environmental Impacts. And our top leadership will now be measured both in terms of the financial outcomes of the group, but also in terms of the impact that the bank makes on society, the economy, and the environment. And more shareholders and investors, especially impact investors, and investors looking at the long term, need to start pressurizing corporates to look at more than just financial returns.
Lovely. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Let's take one more. Someone like to share?
Someone from this side?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Lindy Wezikali. Just maybe 2 points. The one is citizenship. I think there's this one-sided idea of what citizenship is, and it's mainly about receiving, typically from government. I think we need to get back to basics and teach one another and learn about what it means to be a citizen for both individuals as well as companies. Companies are another animal because they just don't even see themselves typically as citizens. But knowing what that means, I think by extension we'll also get to understand where government gets money, because there's this animal called government, just it has money forever and gives, or is expected to give because it's government's thing. The other bit on education, I think our president, or this administration in particular, has made it quite fashionable to not see education as the thing to go for, to do. So as a result, we've got mediocrity, we've got incompetence, we've got... So it's cool not to be educated. And I think we need to get back to having education being sexy again. It's okay, it's actually quite good. We must promote that so that we get out of it, we get excellence, and we drive for that. Personally, I would like to be led by people who are better than me from an ethical perspective, as well as just competence and a sense of excellence. And when we get leaders like that, that we can look up to, I think we get better too, as people, because the sense of leadership is a higher standard. We don't have that currently.
Lovely, thank you. Do you want to make some closing comments?
Anybody from this side? So you're very democratic. It's Coogan right at the back there. There's one gentleman here. We'll come to you now. Just be very quick and short, please.
Senzo Mpele. I think one of the things that you mentioned earlier is the ANC in people's hearts. And I think there has to be some changes that happen in the ANC. And the way that you effect change is that you join and you fight from inside. And I think we can do all that we want, but if the spear and the shield is still in our hearts, we can only change that from internally. I think one of the things Thabo Mbeki said was the biggest mistake he made, was around not raising the next generation of leaders. And I think that is critical. And for me, I think if we want to see quick change, that's where we need to be playing and saying, if a functioning ANC is the best thing for the country right now, then how do we change the ANC and get in there and do whatever we can to effect those changes?
And the last comment from Coogan. Can you manage without a mic?
Yeah, I think so. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
I think just to follow on from Pravin's challenge about an active civil society, and following on from David Lewis and Mandla, and I sit on the steering committee of Future South Africa, also a civil society umbrella body. I think if we do not take Pravin's challenge seriously, we'll end up with what Zimbabwe has just got. And that's not a pleasant situation to be in. So I think, Pravin, it's important that we get back to what we were in the mid-80s, because that's what led to the toppling of the apartheid regime then. And I think, as Mandela said, do to the ANC what you've done to the apartheid government, if they do the same. And I think that's the crisis we are presently in. And I think we need to heed that call and to mobilize. And there are many poor, vulnerable people who are looking for leadership. And as somebody said, maybe we need to take that need and mobilize. Thanks.
Thanks, Coogan.
Okay, let's conclude. What do we do to hold institutions to account? Well, exactly what you've been talking about. Become more aware. I mean, there's one person, Mr. Botha, who goes around by owning one share sometimes.
Yeah, Botha.
And keeps companies and CEOs and chairpersons on their feet. Now, imagine if all of us did that. Just this room. In relation to corporates or annual meetings of ESCOM or whatever the case might be. We'll get a different kind of activism going, but it gives a sense of purpose to all of us as well. Triple PFA and the sort of set-asides for youth, I've lost some sense for where that is going. But I think what we want to do, ideally in the next few months, if things go right, is to develop a more holistic and coherent youth development package. Part of which is the procurement issue, part of which is support for startups, better finance. There's a whole lot of financing agencies, NYDA, CEDA, CIFA, where a lot of money is wasted on administration, not on actually helping people and making sure that the money gets in their hands. If we change all of that overnight, you'll make a huge difference. And we can leverage private sector money as well and take some risks as government to lose some money so that people can actually experiment with certain things and maybe learn from those experiments as well. I think you should take Dave Lewis's point seriously. If each of us gets involved, I mean, commercially you call that crowdfunding, right? So let's crowdfund for civil society and give them the muscle that they actually require, where you think the cause is the right one, the leadership is right, and they're doing the right things. At a day-to-day level. The judgment ultimately is yours, but that is one way of becoming involved as well. Sipho, I want to talk to you afterwards for your advice on a backup plan. And the backup plan is you, by the way. There's no other backup plan. It's what you do and what I do and what everybody else does as citizens to make sure that we continue to build our democracy. The Siemens contribution is an interesting one, and perhaps, Dave, we can introduce you to Siemens now as a source of what do we do tomorrow? I think you've generated some ideas yourselves. Just become a lot more aware and make up your mind that every week 2 hours shall go to some activity for a start. And if you start that way, that 2 hours could grow into 4 hours, and you'll begin to develop an interest in one thing or another. I'm sure most people here have some basic empathy for other human beings, some basic solidarity with people who are poor or marginalized or need a hand to move from where they are to the next stage in whatever they're actually doing. And that'll give you a huge gratification, by the way. Just personally, and if you like, broadly speaking, spiritually, although there's a person more qualified to speak about that than I am, I must concede. How many people need to be arrested? Not too many. Not too many, but they're not just on the NEC, by the way. They're in corporates as well, as we're hearing. So it's financial institutions alone, I saw an estimate on CNN, by 2020 would have paid $200 billion in fines. Now that can't be because they were eating cupcakes. Right? Every single scandal, oops, my apologies. Every single scandal.
Someone heard you.
Yeah. Every single scandal has an accountant, a lawyer, a financial institution, etc. They're all involved. And so the question of ethics, the question of shame, the question of guilt, the question of being good citizens is a serious challenge in each of these institutions. And we should certainly ask the kind of questions that you ask. And Abdullah, you've provided your own answer. I think that's an excellent point that you make about becoming an energized society, which is what I've been appealing for. Because if we do, I don't know why I remain such a bloody optimist, but I think if we all can just become inspired for a couple of years to do the right thing, do good, build the solidarity that we actually require, we have more than what it takes to and we shouldn't just worry about losing the Rugby World Cup, because there's greater things we can do. And once we've lost the shine that we had at South Africa, the Mandela shine. And if we just as South Africans say, we don't want to be left with the identity of, a G family or whatever the case might be. That's not our identity. What do you want as your identity? What do you want to be known by as a people and as a society and as a nation around the world? Until now, if you said Mandela, they say, wow, what a country you come from. I'm not sure what they're going to say now. The opportunity we have, ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, is to put the shine on again by the collective effort that we can make. And I think it's absolutely possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Pravin, for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been a special occasion. I hope you go away, let's have a drink, but I hope you go away with some idea about what to do differently the rest of this year or 2018. Can I just remind you on the 28th that we'll be having a foresight forum looking at next year, and we'll have a panel consisting of Colin Coleman from Goldman Sachs, Kuseni Dlamini from Massmart, Angelo Fick from ENCA, Adam Cracker from Business IQ, and Tembekile Makwetu, the Auditor General, as well as Jacques Poe. So if you want to come and think about next year and what the shape of that landscape looks like, please come along and book. And thank you very much for coming. Let's go home. Well, MPG. Fantastic. Well done. Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you.
Very good. Well done. Very good job. Good introduction. It was a good introduction, the guilt and shame. Yeah.